Graduated and then his doctorate in physical chemistry at the University of Bonn. Then moved to Reading, UK in the 70s. And was one of the persons involved in the development of the discipline of biomimetics. Since then, he kept working on biomimetics, and now he's the director of the Center of Biomimetics at the University of Reading, and he's as well involved in design because he's co-director of emerging technology at the Architectural Association. Today, he will talk about bio-inspiration for adaptive design solution, and I need
Thank you.
George.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much for the invitation to give a talk. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. This is a very big field, and trying to condense things in 1 hour is not easy. 20 years ago, when I started doing that, I could deal with the whole of biomimetics in 1 hour. Now I probably need about 20 hours, and even then. So the field is really growing very fast. And my background is not in architecture, it's in physics and mechanical engineering, materials, structures, and design. But I worked with biologists for most of my career. And it is really through this synergy with the biological world that I realized, and others, that there were a lot of interesting solutions that one could try to use. The application of biomimetics covers a big, big field, from nanotechnology up to certainly the building scale. Now, the challenge in this lecture has been that Claudia wanted to have something on an urban scale, okay, which is, well, I don't have any answers, but I've got some ideas, and perhaps it's up to you to take it further. Certainly it's a big challenge, but there are a lot of similarities between architecture, buildings, urban environments, and biology. More than one thing. And I'm going to try to explain a little bit how I see them, how we can extract information, how we can get some ideas, and how we can translate them. So that's essentially the topic. And of course, when we talk about biology, we need to keep our eyes and minds open. Okay, we can learn from any one kind of species, whether it's insects or mammals or trees or plants or marine animals. Every one of them has got something which is useful, something which is interesting, and of course something which has allowed that particular species to survive. So that's really the subject. And the first thing that I need to qualify, especially because in a growing field, everybody involved has got his own view as to what biomimetics is, okay, and is part of the process, if you like. Again, I would like to stick to what I believe is the right approach, for me anyway, which is really an abstraction process. We don't want to copy nature. We can use nature, but we don't want to copy nature. Okay? What we want to get is some inspiration, and then translate that idea into something which is useful in terms of good design, which covers, again, a very vast field, whether it is material level, structural level, building level, whatever. There are lots of examples of things, and again, I'm given the amount of time, I can only scratch the surface a little bit. I think it's also important, if you want to follow the thing a bit more, to be aware that there are various other words which are used, and they are all essentially interchangeable. Biomimetics is what has happened here and in the States. In fact, the biggest impetus to biomimetics came from a big research program in the States around about 1985, and then the word stuck. Okay, more and more people talk about bioinspiration, which is a bit broader perhaps, and in the German-speaking world, where they also had an evolution of the same kind of thinking, they coupled together the words biology and technical aspects. So you get this bionic. Now, bionic, unfortunately, in English means something completely different, because bionic is interpreted as the interface between electronics and biology, whereas that is only a very small part. Okay, so it's a question of being aware. But there is a useful website in various places, but this one is a biocode, which is, I'll mention later, which is, it's a international network for people interested in these kind of things. And if anybody's interested, I can give you more detail. Julian Vincent was my colleague, biology colleague, for 25 years already, and it is really, he came up with this definition, which I still think is the most appropriate one. And if we go one step further, what I really want to try to explain is that what I'm interested in functional aspects. Whether they are functional at the level of single organisms, whether they are functional at the level of a collection of organisms, and whatever not. But it is really to try to extract some functional attributes which we think is desirable, functional attributes which we think can respond to some of the problems we have. And as I said before, the problems at the end of the day are not very different between ourselves, yourselves as architects, engineers, structural engineers, whatever, and what biology has to do. So it's really a question of capturing these functional attributes of the organisms, or systems, and then translate them into innovative technological solutions. So back to the challenge for me, how can biomedics influence design and performance on an urban scale? Okay? In other words, what can we capture from any one of these kind of systems, okay? And then try to feed it back into the urban scale. So, as I said, I don't have any answers, but there are a number of things which have happened. And I think one of the more important lessons in not only biomedics, but in architecture, especially in architecture in the urban scale, in relation to climate change, sustainability, whatever not. The first lesson you have to learn is that there are no magic bullets, and everything is small increments. You make progress by a little bit at a time. That's very evolutionary, actually. Okay, if you take the analogy with biology, things have happened over hundreds of millions of years. Every little step has contributed. There's never been a dramatic change other than big events like dinosaurs, extinction, whatever not. But on the whole, what I'm saying is that there is a little bit of an arrogance in the modern world, thinking that technology can suddenly, make you switch from 0 to 100 in one gigantic step. It's not like that. And there are very good reasons why it's not like that. And some of these reasons we find them embedded in how biology has evolved. So, if we want to start thinking about biology as a kind of repository for ideas and solutions, we need to understand what are the, you may call the design drivers of biological systems. What makes biology tick, so to speak? Well, the first thing biology has got to do, like our buildings or ourselves or anything else, you've got to really live, function in a physical-chemical environment. Okay? And by that I cover everything. Chemical environment, wind, earthquakes, high temperatures, low temperature, lots of rain, water, sunlight, whatever you want. This is the physical environment in all its constituent parts. More importantly, this environment is not static. This environment is dynamic. It's changing all the time, and because we can see now with climate change and all that, the consequences of that. So the problem is not so much designing something for a given fixed environment. The challenge of biology and the answer of biology is to design something which can adapt, because adaptation is the biggest lesson you can learn from biology. And that adaptation is the key to being able to survive in these variable environments. And of course, on top of the environment itself, the other thing which is needed for survival is simply energy. Whether you are a mouse, or an ant, or a human being, or whatever else, you need energy. And the strategy that biology uses to capture energy, manipulate, convert energy are, as yet, different from ours, okay, and in many ways, more appropriate perhaps in some cases to ensure the survival. So that's the drivers. What are the processes
the design processes themselves? Well, the design processes are really to do with adaptation, evolution, natural selection, whatever you want to call it. They're all facets of the same thing. And there are two important bits behind that. One is the genotype, the genetic information, which is passed on from generation to generation. There is the genetic variability, which allows things to branch off and see whether they are better suited for that particular environment. And then there is the one which is often forgotten. There is a lot of emphasis which has been put on the genotypes and genetic variability, but there is the phenotypes, in many ways, are more important than the genotypes, because the phenotypes, which are really the modulation of the genetic information in relation to the environment, okay, is often more important. Let me give you a simple example of that. If you go to I like plants, okay? I work a lot with plants. I think plants have got a lot to teach us. I'm trying to show you that. And it's quite interesting that if you go and look at a plantation of trees, where every single tree is a clone from one single source, in other words, they are genetically absolutely identical. So bit by bit in the DNA, this is the same thing. You look at the trees, all the shapes are different. Okay? There are slightly different shapes because the environment, the local environment where tree 1 is not the same as the local environment where tree 5 is. Maybe only 5 meters away. The trees can detect the difference and adapt to the difference. This is the phenotypic response. So both of them are important. The genotypic information is the one which is transmitted, but the modulation, if you like, on a different time scale is done by the phenotypes. So it's really the combination of the environmental aspects on the one hand and these design processes that leads to what you may call smart adaptive biological systems. Okay, let's try to go one step further. Okay, in order to react to environments, you need two things. Okay, and no matter how much you can argue about it, without those it would not work. So, first of all, you have to capture information from the environment. Okay? So it's no good saying, I'm going to have a building here, and then I'm going to try to smarten up this building. If you don't have sensing functions of some kind, you're not going to go very far. So capturing information from the environment is an absolutely fundamental step in being able to react to the environment. So there's a whole bunch of sensory functions. And if you look at the sensory function of biology, you can find almost anything you want. We've got electrical sensors, magnetic sensors, optical sensors, radiation sensors, vibration sensors, I mean everything, okay? And the level, the threshold of sensitivity of these things is probably 100 times better for the moment than the best sensors we have. And I'll give you an example of that. I was talking to someone who was designing earthquake detectors. And they were sent as an international commission when there was the tsunami 6-7 years ago. And because they wanted to see the effect of the tsunami and the devastation, of course, the loss of life and whatever not. And he says what was fascinating to us was that when we went around, we found out a lot of people dead, of course, and we found very few dead animals. All the animals had picked up the information and run away. So what kind of sensing devices do they have to be able to intercept this information and do something about it? So they are very, very important things, and there's an awful lot of work in biometrics going on in trying to understand how the sensory functions work and how we can use that kind of approach. So sensing the information is one step, and then acting on the information is the next step. It's all very well to say, well, I know that something is happening, what am I going to do about it? So as well as having the sensory functions, you need to have some actuation functions. And I use the term actuation in a very broad sense again. Muscles is one mechanism of actuation, but plants have got other things. They don't have muscles, and yet they can move very happily. There are all sorts of tricks, if you like, which biology has evolved, which allow you to respond to these environments. And of course, at the basis of that, because these things, whether they are the actuators or the sensory thing, they need energy. So energy capture still is pretty well at the base of the whole process. And there are, and I'm anticipating some of the things, but we might as well, energy capture is done in a variety of different ways. And the only source of energy, apart from specialized animals living in the sea, near sort of thermal sources of energy, 99% of what we use as energy comes one way or the other from the sun. Okay? And the problem with solar energy is not that there isn't enough, there is plenty of solar energy. The problem is that it is a diffuse source of energy. Okay? It's not concentrated in a package like a gallon of petrol or a ton of coal or a nuclear power station. It's plenty of energy is all over the place, and we have a problem because biology uses that energy not often directly, in the sense that part of it is used instantaneously and the other part is stored. So we've got two levels. We've got energy capture, and we are developing a lot of stuff, photovoltaics, other systems, wind power and solar power and tidal power, and more perhaps also using some biological sources of energy like the ones that cloud and magma are developing. But this energy is not used in the same way as in the biological world. Okay? If you take the archetypal solar collector, which is the leaf of a plant, okay, only part of the energy captured is used instantaneously, the other part is stored in a chemical form in a variety of different parts of the tissues. We are very good at energy capture, or getting better. We are hopeless, absolutely dead hopeless at energy storage. Especially when the sources of energy are diffuser sources of energy. We get to the crazy situation in Scotland where they install big wind turbines. They have actually to shut down the turbines when the wind is blowing hard, which is at the moment at the peak of the generation cycle, because there is too much energy being produced and nobody knows how to store it. So they have to shut down the turbines when effectively they should be, I mean, if you like, that kind of argument will not be able to survive the test of evolution. Nothing working on that basis will ever be able to test. It's just not sustainable. So, a big challenge, whether it is whatever scale, is energy storage. And as I said, at the moment we're not really good. If we go back to the processes themselves, okay, and just to recall what the things are, well, a lot of what is the consequence of the three processes there, adaptation, evolution, genotypes, phenotypes, is a bunch of shapes, forms, morphologies, and all these are in response to these inputs. We've got a material system which is almost unique in that 99% of biology is made of fibers. Okay, you are made of fibers, your bones are made of fibers, your skin is made of fibers, all your internal tissues are made of fibers and water and a bit of calcium, carbonate. Trees are made of fibers. Every single living thing on this planet is made of fibers. And it's not an accidental thing. Evolutionarily speaking, we don't know how it started, but what we do know is that fibers allow you to create functionality and shapes and geometries that you could not create easily with other processes. So fibrous functions dominate, and this is simply the result of some of the processes we mentioned before. And then, of course, structural performance, but that, again, needs to be put in the context of energy. So the question is, sometimes, one argues whether, in fact, when we talk about evolution, are we really talking about the survival of the fittest, or are we really talking about the survival of the cheapest? Okay, energy is the critical issue, and any kind of system which wastes energy and is not capable of being very efficient in the use of energy, storage or capture is not going to survive. So we need to at least have this kind of things in motion. Okay, I put this picture simply because there is, as I said a lot, this was 2005, almost 10 years ago, okay? And there's been a lot of things happening since in all kind of sectors of human endeavor. So, but basically the message is engineers and architects, I think, put it together, are really taking a leaf out of Edge's book and looking for a solution to this problem. This is what it's all about. Okay. So how does that work? How does the process of biometrics work? And as I said, it really is very important to ensure that one is not simply trying to copy something which by definition doesn't make any sense. Okay? And I remember years ago we were working on the structure of trees and plants, and journalists come and talk to you and say, well, why do you want to make an artificial tree? And I said, I don't want to make an artificial tree. I want to understand how the tree works. And then use the ideas with different materials, on different scale, different fabrication processes in order to optimize some performance. So the process is really one of steps. In order to use biology, you really need to understand biology. There's no point. There's an awful lot of information out there coming out from biologists, okay? And someone needs to translate, someone needs to identify, and someone needs to try to turn it into something else. So, and this is just a simple example from some colleagues in Freiburg who work a lot with plant systems, and they had in mind to design a structural element which was based on a kind of bamboo-type plant. Okay, so what they did is start with understanding the biological system in detail, the material, the structure, the topology, etc., understanding the principles behind the functionality of this thing. This thing is simply a beam which is swaying in the wind and needs to resist essentially wind loads. Okay? And then comes the important step, which is abstracting the concept. Forget about it. From there on, the biology doesn't exist anymore. Okay? Because if you hang on to the biology, very often you're going to mistarget your application. And then there's the technical implementation. So this is a process where you need to get the input from the biological world, you need to abstract it into a series of concepts, then you forget about the biology and you move on with what you have available in order to achieve what you want to do. Okay, if you look at examples, people are starting with termite nests. Okay. Interestingly enough, in this particular system, the material system itself doesn't play a big role. It's just mud with a few bits of plant material. But of course, the morphology of the inside structure of this thing is key to the functionality of the object. Not only that, but in this particular case, it is often forgotten. This is not a static object. The interaction between the termites and this thing is the way in which it functions. In other words, the inhabitants are part of the system. They are not just there as passive things. They are part of the system. And again, a lot of work has been done, and I can't go into too much detail. But to explain this question of abstraction, I'll give you a very simple example, and in many ways, it's the one which really started biometrics, if you like, in the modern sense. Biometrics, in the sense, has been going around forever. People have always looked at biology for inspiration of some kind of technical as well as artistic, if you like. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, etc., etc. But this is the first recent one, and it's such a spectacular success that it's the one which everybody quotes, not surprisingly, because it's a good example of the step of understanding the biology, abstracting the concept, and then forget about the biology. This is a weed which grows in steppe as well, and like all plants, they have a problem in dispersing their genetic information, okay? So they do it via seeds, and in order to maximize the chances of success, the seeds should really move as far away as possible from the parent plant. And of course, plants cannot move, so it's not easy to do that. So plants have had to evolve tricks and use all sorts of tricks to make sure that the seeds can be propagated. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things one can learn from seed propagation mechanisms. This one here, when the seeds are created, this is a seed, it's about the size of a pea. Okay, it's got these little hooks all around it. And okay, this is an investment in energy. Okay, this is a material, okay, and you wonder, well, why is this thing bothering to put hooks, okay, on the thing? Well, the hooks are important because that's the way the seed can attach itself to an animal, a bird, or something else, and then be moved somewhere else where it can germinate. So the guy who looked at that was just curious, and so that's the biology, a very relatively simple system of a surface covered with hooks. We understand the function, and what do we do with it? Well, if you had this thing under your eyes, what kind of thing would you do with it? This is where you need to start stretching your mind, okay? And the result of this process is what we all know, which is called Velcro. The guy who invented Velcro in 1948 was Jeronimidis, a Swiss guy. He was apparently walking with his dog and then came back home and found his seeds attached to the fur of the dog, being kind of curious kind of person, looked a bit in detail and realized what was the trick, if you like. And then, because as it happened, he was working in the textile industry, he had the flash of imagination to say, look, but if biology can do that, we can do a similar thing. The material is different, the mechanism is not exactly the same. This is not a copy. This is an interpretation of this, okay? And this is the abstraction part. And of course, because it can be done on a textile technology base, then this thing really was quite easy to make, so to speak. And, you know, Velcro nowadays you find it everywhere. So you can't argue about the fact that it is a successful story. And there have been others like that. The next one of relevance is this one, which has actually got a bearing on the issue of architectural buildings. I don't know if you know about this thing. Okay, and just to summarize, this is a study which did not have biometrics in mind at the time. It was purely an exercise in biology to find out how leaves generally manage to keep themselves clean by having a characteristic which allows contamination, represented here by this red dust, to be washed away very easily when the rain comes. Okay, so on the left you've got the contamination on the surface, on the right you've got the water sprinkled over it. And then the water runs off, and what is interesting is that all the particles are in the water, not left on the leaf. Back to the biology, this is important. Remember, this is the solar collector. Okay, so if you start contaminating the surface, you lose energy conversion. If you lose energy conversion, you're not going to survive. So, evolutionarily speaking, plants which adapted to this problem, in other words, created a surface which could produce this effect, had an advantage, and etc. Notice that we have got exactly the same problem. If you go to places which have got vast arrays of photovoltaics collectors, okay, one of the biggest problems is keeping them clean. It's exactly the same problem. Because if they don't keep them clean, the efficiency, which is already not very high, will drop down. And so you need to spend energy, time, money, whatever, just to keep the surface of these things clean. Well, plants had the same problem, and they found a solution. The solution is really to create a surface which, far from being smooth, which we normally associate with an easy to clean kind of surface, It's actually a very convoluted surface. It's made of waxes, extruded like cells. You can see top cells underneath here. This is a wax crystallized into macrocrystals. So you've got a very, very convoluted surface that provides two things. One, it stops the water from wetting the surface, so the water cannot spread out. Okay? It remains as a sphere. This is important because then it can run off very easily. The second thing is that given the fact that you've got all this kind of hairy surface, the particles of contamination have got very little points of contact with the surface, so they are easy to remove. Okay? And when the water goes over the particle, the physics of wetting say, look, the particle here prefers to stick to the water rather than stick to the surface. Okay? So the physics behind is very, very simple. Okay? Surface tension and nothing more. So basically you've got this situation, which is a wettable surface, big interaction between particles and surface, and wetting of the water, so it doesn't run very easily. Hairy surface, you've got spherical water, which runs off, and then more importantly is the fact that the contact points here are very few, water runs off, contact area between the particle and the water is much bigger, particles stick to the water, water runs off, and that's it. It's so simple, basically. Now, being simple doesn't mean that it is obvious how to make it, in fact, because you need to create that surface topology and you need to create it at the right scale. Okay, and that is not necessary. So it took about 8 years, 10 years to go from the understanding of how it works to having a product which actually does do the job. And the product is called Lotus Effect or Lotusine. Lotusine was one of the commercial products which actually was designed for buildings. And the idea was to coat it outside of buildings with stuff so that buildings would get contaminated by dust and particles, whatever not, instead of having to go with aggressive chemicals, a lot of energy, manpower to wash them off and scrape them off, you just go with a hose and the particles will stick to the water, and you can go to internet and look at Lotusine and you will see little films, and they're very effective how this thing can collect all this stuff and the surface behind the tree. And then once you understand the trick, you can start doing the same thing on surfaces which are notoriously difficult, like this is a wood surface, normally water will penetrate, but here it doesn't. These are textile, more and more textile industry. Same kind of trick here, contamination and the particles going in the water. And then you've got individual fibers, artificial fibers, which are the surface of which is creating the topography, which is needed to have this effect here. And there is a company making clothing which uses that, and you just spill your coffee, you just run it under the tap, the water runs off, the particles run off. You may say, well, what? Okay, sure enough, this is, when you start building things that size, 500 meters, 800 meters, 1 kilometer, well, who's going to clean the windows? Who's going to clean the surfaces? Who's going to clean the whatever? And if you want to do it, you can do it at great expense. If you have surfaces treated with this kind of effect, then I'm not saying that it is not difficult, but it's certainly a lot cheaper, energetically speaking, to make a thing with that kind of thing. And a similar example of that is to do with sharks, which swim, and they've got the skin, which are they don't have fish scales like normal scales. They've got this interconnecting, sort of bridged with things. And biologists have suspected for years that this was to do with conserving energy in swimming. In other words, reducing drag. If you're moving something in water, okay, what a lot of the energy you consume is to do with the drag, the friction between the liquid and the solid. Sharks are very strange animals. Notice that sharks have been around for 300 million years and they haven't changed very much. Okay, they've reached pretty well the top of the performance level. The question was, A, was that thing true? Two, if it was true, what could we do with it? So, and as I said, for the shark, it is actually very important because sharks don't have a swim bladder. A swim bladder is a balloon that other fish can contract. So if they want to stop in mid-water, they just inflate the bag, get the buoyancy, so they don't have to move forward in order to stay where they are. Sharks do not have a swimming bladder, which means that if they don't move forward, they will sink. And sharks are predators, and they want to swim essentially 24 hours a day throughout their life. If you want to do that, I can assure you that the little bit of drag reduction you get from here is absolutely crucial to make this thing survive. Okay, so does it work? Well, people in Germany were interested in airplanes, and they started doing studies on models, verified that yes, you get a reduction in drag. Secondly, they do the abstraction, which is do we have to have this complicated shape, or can we get away with simpler shapes if we use the same principle? Okay, the scale is also different because they're interested in airplanes moving in air rather than fish moving in water, but the concept is the same. And then they coated the fuselage of two Airbuses with a film, plastic polymer film, which has one of these patterns, I don't know which one. And then they run this thing for several years and measured simply the amount of fuel used by these planes, and they discovered that, yes, indeed, all the planes, the two planes which had this shark skin surface, as it's called, did use less fuel for the same mileage. So, again, an advantage. And this is 1998. Okay, this plane is just about beginning to be operational. The Airbus A340, the wings and the fuselage of the, which is mainly composite materials, all the surfaces are effectively sculpted in order to give the shark effect. How much do you save? About 3%. Well, 3% is a huge number. If you think about the amount of fuel that the plane consumes during its operational life, which is typically 20 years, you know, if you can save 3%, it makes a big difference. And this is what I'm saying again, what I said at the beginning. Okay? If you have small changes, small improvements, but multiplied by large numbers, you get very big benefits without having to have these gigantic quantities. Okay, and is that important in structures? It is, because again, the same problem. When you design a tower of this kind, which is up 1 kilometer, the biggest problem you have is the swaying of the tower. The swaying of the tower comes from the interaction between the fluid, i.e. the wind, and the surface. If you can reduce drag, you diminish the probability of having oscillations, and therefore you can make the tower cheaper, etc. So all these things are beginning to allow little bit at a time in order to get a benefit in at least energy terms, if nothing else. So where is this thing going today? Well, it's going all over the place, okay? And well, I try to put some kind of logic out. There is a big chunk of biomedics happening at the molecular level. Medicine, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, nanotechnologies, materials. We have self-repair, self-assembly, self-organization, and to some extent services, as you can see. Then you've got a cell, which is the sort of smallest attribute biologically which performs a function, if you like, assembled together in the tissue, okay, and we're beginning to use information from this system for materials, textiles, fibers, structures, a bit of architecture, energy management, metabolism, and all. Then we've got an organ, which is an assembly of tissues with a specific functionality associated with it. Okay, your heart is an organ, your liver is an organ. They are made of the same chemicals, but they are doing different jobs. Okay, and a lot of the different jobs come from different organizations. So again, composite materials, smart systems, architecture, actuators, artificial muscles, and all. And then we've got the organism, the entity itself. Okay, this is where we need to, up to here, we can lead with smartness rather than intelligence. And from here to here, we need to add some level of intelligence in the sense of brain functions or brain type functions. And these are important for communication as well as for processing information coming from sensory functions. So this is what people in chemistry are playing around with, understanding and illustrating. And one interesting thing that has come out of things like that is these optical functions. And this is fascinating. I mean, all these things are different colors, and none of these things has got a chemical in it. None of these colors is relying on a dye, which is the way we use in the textile industry or whatever. No, the color solvents. We use dyes, which are again aggressive chemicals very often. Whatever. All these things are happening because of the structure. So the feathers of the peacock, beetles, or these marine animals can exhibit almost any color. And they are called structural colors. They depend on geometry, shape, and form. And really to do with the organization. This is a butterfly, this is a good example. This thing has got white wings and a black dot. And the black dot is not a dye located in there. It's simply the fact that the white part of the wing, if you look at the scales, it's got this structure here. And we're talking about nanometers, okay, microns, nanometers. Okay, you've got all these particles, and the effect of that is to reflect back all the wavelengths. So you are scattering all the light, and when you get all the frequencies, you get white light. Okay, white light is by definition a combination of all the colors together. There is no selectivity in what is reflected back. Everything is reflected, so you see white. When you want to have black, you take the little balls away, and this is black. This is the thing which, when you get the light in there, the light doesn't get reflected back because the particles are not there. So when everything is absorbed, we see as black. So this thing can create white and black purely by structural means. And any kind of color, because the color itself depends on the size of these particles and the distance. So you find all these interesting things, butterfly wings, and you can change the color of these things. In fact, there are some industries that are beginning to work on this kind of thing. I find it absolutely fascinating, because not only because you get these physical colors coming out from the structure, but because if you change the dimensions of the structure, you change the color. So if I've got a kind of structure like this one, and that gives me red, if I stretch it a bit, I will change the pattern, and I can get another color from the same thing, simply by deforming it. Okay, wonderful. If we can do it. Okay, nanotechnology is getting there. 3D printing or 3D nanoprinting, which is beginning to emerge, it will be capable of doing things like that. Other optical devices like that. And I'm just running through examples, okay, of little steps which again contribute on a small level but can be integrated on a bigger level. There's a company in Germany who makes solar panels, not photovoltaics. These are pipes with water. And they were interested in optimizing the flow of the water inside the pipes. And then, again, they asked themselves, well, is there something similar which happens in biology? Well, yes, there is, as it happens, because distributing a fluid inside a large surface is what you have to have in a leaf. So they started talking to biologists, got some ideas, got some models, system to work on, measure things, and whatever not, and they then extracted the information, and they converted into not only an artifact in the sense of having designed solar panels which where the flow for the hot water is going in a way which is very difficult to anticipate by no means. This is what is interesting. If you ask someone with the capacity of doing this kind of heat flow, thermal energy, whatever not, it will not come out with that kind of shape. Okay, that kind of shape comes from here. Okay, and they demonstrated that it is optimal, and now we have software which allows it. So you end up with things which even with the best knowledge on an engineering technical aspect, you will not necessarily going to find unless you look at the biological equivalent, if you like. And this is another example, very briefly, because again, it's a similar kind of thing. This is a guy in Germany who is interested in the shape of a lot of biological structures, and is interested in the shape of particularly branching trees, like this one here, and said, well, what is the optimal shape of this thing here, so as to minimize the risk of failure of this thing. And then it developed a piece of software which you can plug in as part of the final development program, and it runs the thing, and it starts from an unoptimized shape, which is here to the left, and it goes to an optimized shape to the right with a series of rules, and he ends up with this thing here, which shows the minimum stress level in this area here compared to this one. Okay? What is this shape? Well, it's not one that we can define. Okay? We can certainly look at it, we can characterize it, but it's not an equation that we can find in any book, because that doesn't come from the same process. It comes from a process of interaction between a load pattern on the one hand and a material adaptation internally, which is the reconfiguration of that shape. So it's essentially an optimization algorithm, okay, which is then being used for other engineering applications. And similarly, we've got a lot of things which come from biology, which sometimes we forget it. Okay, we've got genetic algorithm, evolutionary algorithm, neural networks, agent-based systems. I mean, these are simply equivalents of the system we find in biology. Okay? We are essentially trying to extract some of the rules, which part of which were the ones I mentioned in the beginning, i.e. genotypes, phenotypes, variability, etc. Okay, the materials play a big role, as I said, and you see some examples of how much differentiation is important at the appropriate scale, and then you need to introduce anisotropy, which is really to do with the fibers and the directionality of the properties coming out from the presence of fibers. Heterogeneity, we don't have any continuous materials. We don't have anything like a piece of glass in biology. Okay, we've got materials which are glass-like, but they are not structured the same way as a sheet of glass or a piece of steel or a piece of concrete. We've got a lot of hierarchies, different organizations at different scales, and all these are important because they allow you to do things that you would not be able to do with a normal material. So what I'm saying is that if you take that aspect of biology, we wouldn't have the biology that we have today. I think it's pretty well impossible to have a biology based on steel, concrete, and glass, basically. They are pretty good materials, but they are not sufficiently flexible from a design point of view to allow to really open up the possibilities. So we come back to the task in hand, okay, and the reason why I said before that there are a lot of similarities between buildings and plants is the fact that, as I said, first of all, both of them are rooted to the ground. They can't go away. If there is a problem, if there is a threat, if there is a change of something, they cannot go and find a comfortable place somewhere else. They have to design themselves in a way to resist all these changes coming from inside. So you've got your solar collectors, which are the leaves. Okay, you've got the self-supporting structure, which is the trunk and the branches. You've got motor movement, I'll come back to that. You've got all sorts of sensing gravity, sensing light, and responding to these things. And then you've got the response of the sensing shape adaptation. One of the interesting things is motor movement. Remember, this is a sequoia, okay? It's about 100 meters. The water comes from the roots, of course, and goes all the way up here. Okay? So you need to pump water 100 meters up, and not small quantities of water. Okay? We're talking about hundreds of liters a day. So where is the pump? If you need to move water 100 meters up, you need a big, hefty pump. There are no pumps. The whole process occurs because of the integration of all these things together, so that the same material is used to allow it, cellulose fibers, And the water is effectively due to the evaporation at the level of the leaves, which creates a negative pressure, which sucks the water up. Okay? And again, it's a physical principle which has been known for years, and the plants have simply used it to meet it. So you can move vast amounts of water without any moving parts. Okay? Of course, that's quite successful. So again, passive systems, we've got some interesting things which we can learn from organizing material in passive systems like pine cones and other types for releasing seeds. And you can get changes of shape, beneficial changes of shape, simply as a change of humidity. So again, what biology is doing, again, is using the environment as a source of energy for what it needs to achieve. Okay? Here the energy for this process is coming simply from evaporation of the water when the thing is released. Okay? So this is in the closed system, full of water, dries up and opens up. And the seeds come off. Okay. For the plant, this is the important thing. But we can learn how to organize the system so that we can get similar kind of effect. Okay, these are the mechanics of the thing. It's not, you can do that very easily if you take a piece of plywood, which is normally, even the simplest piece of plywood is 3 plies, okay, 2 plies like that and 1 like that, okay, and the reason why it's 3 plies is because you want to avoid curvature when you have a change in moisture. If you take a 3-ply plywood and remove one of the layers, top one, you will get big changes of shape as a result of changing moisture, drying or heat. So you can get all sorts of weird things, and all sorts of seed pods do that as part of their strategy for distribution. This is an active system where you've got integrated, the sensor and the actuation are embedded in the same system. We don't have a separate object which you call the sensor and one which you call the actuator. The actuation comes from the response of the material to changes in humidity, and the sensing comes simply from the level of humidity inside the system. And we designed years ago a textile prototype related to that on a small scale, which then was turned into something like a garment. More interesting is this one, and this is actually hydroscope, which is which copied something fast. This thing is made of bits which open and close as a result of changes in humidity. So what I'm saying is that if you've got an environment where you want to control humidity, instead of having a kilowatt type air conditioning system, if you get it right, okay, if you understand how it works, you can use an entirely passive system, because the sensor is embedded in the system and the actuation is embedded in the system. You don't have any intelligence, you don't have any circuits, you don't have any computers, you don't have any, basically you don't have anything which can go wrong. These things can be extremely reliable simply because of that. And you can get big changes of shape if you get it right. This is another beautiful example. How much time? Another 10 minutes? Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. And this is again because there is an application of that to building. And this is based on this flower called Strelitzia. And the pollinator for this flower is a bird, it's not an insect. And in order to pollinate, okay, or in order for the bird to capture the pollen, okay, the bird perches up here and this flexes down. And as it flexes down, it opens this pocket. So you've got a beam bending down, and simultaneously this opens access to the food that the bird wants to capture, and of course the pollen that the plant wants to transmit to the bird. And it's very selective because, of course, if you're not the right weight, you're not going to open it. Okay, so if you are an insect, you have no chance. You have to be a bird of minimum size, minimum weight, in order to get it. This thing here can operate backwards and forwards more than 1,000 times. That's been measured. So it's pretty robust. And the trick is really quite simple again. If you think about it, it will be a beam in bending and a kind of membrane coupled to the beam, And one can show from a mechanical point of view, if you do that and you bend the beam, the membrane will rotate. So there's a coupling between the bending of a beam and the rotation of a flap. So again, simulation, modeling, whatever, physical modeling, computer modeling, and eventually this is the end result. And this thing is something which is designed to provide shading to things, but rather than having to pull up and down these things, okay, it is driven by the external environment, and you can use as a trigger temperature, light, or humidity, whatever you want. If you're talking about shading, light probably, or energy associated with light. So down here, there is simply a piece of material which reacts to heat and light by contracting and expanding, and then the expansion is translated into bending, the bending is translated into rotation. So this is it. And this thing was used as part of this thing in 2012. So these things here are all can be moved and produce different kind of shading indices. The last bit is to do with, so these are all passive systems. Passive in the sense that there is only the structure and the material itself which provide the function. Active system exists as well, and we've got cells full of water, and the pressure inside the cells, organized in tissues, can produce a number of reactions, like deployment, which is what leaves do, like a collapse, like here, which is the spinosa pubica, or fast movement, like leaf flight. And this is the underside of the leaf, and these are the cells which are responsible for controlling the evaporation of water. So the tree can control whether it wants to release water or not by opening and closing this pair of cells. It's like two sausages. Okay, you increase the pressure, you change the shape. You change the shape, you close or open. The way it works physically is that you've got a membrane and you've got water movement controlled by chemistry. And these are essentially what is called the pressure osmotic system. The pressure inside is being measured to 20 bar and more. 20 bar is 10 times the pressure of the tires of the car. So these things can generate huge, huge pressures and relatively low energetic cost, so long as you go the right chemistry in place. So by manipulating the pressure, by manipulating the organization of the tissues and cells, you can produce all sorts of different shape changes. And one of the interesting things which has happened in the last 2 years, and which relates a little bit to the question of now collectives rather than individuals, are two projects, European projects. One is about to do with root systems, and people are interested in the way a root system explore communication, nutrients, anchorage, okay? And they've done a lot of work, and this is the website. Down here, there's films and images, and this is what, so this thing is exploring. It's touching, so it's got a sensing device, which tells you I'm touching something. It can decide whether to push or simply to go around. It will absorb water, lots of water. Incidentally, if you think about all the flooding which is going on at the moment in the west part of the country, one of the biggest remedies to flooding is big trees. Big trees in the root can collect so much water, people just do not understand how important they are for buffering out the water inputs in some cases. So these things are changing direction, responding to chemical gradients, responding to light, whatever not, and communicating with each other as well, which is quite interesting. So again, multifunctional. Okay, all these things are done by the same thing. And remember, this is not more than a bunch of small balloons full of water under pressure, okay, made of a bag of fibers. That's all. Plus a bit of smart chemistry. So they're studying all that, and the application of that is in robotics with what is called an osmotic actuator. This is interesting because this is the first time people are using exactly the mechanism of biology to produce an energy conversion system which is well outside the normal electrical batteries and whatever else. So again, it's a system which can exploit the energy embedded in the environment rather than having to have a source of energy from the outside. And the other one, which has to do with the sensory function, again, this is another project. They used electrodes like they do with humans when you go to hospital to measure things. And then they stimulate the plants in a variety of ways. And this one has been stimulated by simply heat, if you like. And they simply measure the response of the plant. And, okay, on a single plant is quite interesting, there are lots of things. But what is interesting is the fact that the idea is that you can use these plants in the environment itself, okay, and use the sensory functions of the plant to inform you of things happening. There is more water than I want. There is less water than I want. The temperature is going up. I need to do something. And the plants can communicate that, not only to themselves, but to neighbors and then to the outside world at the same time. And again, I suggest if you are interested, look at the website. There are amazing things where if you have in agriculture as well, or mixed urban agriculture, you can say, look, I need to be watered, okay, or I'm happy, etc., etc. So all this information can be captured. So this is something we did with Eva in the AA for the AD magazine to do with really this connection between forests and trees and urban environments at the same time. But in fact, I mean, if you look at the listing here, Stefan Guerri, the vertical forest, or whatever it's called, it's more appropriate to think about that. I mean, really, truly, one needs to understand it, as well as trying to replicate in a technical context the properties of plants or animals or tissues coming from plants and animals. There is the other level, which is to say, well, these things are already doing good things. Why don't we use them? Because they are capable of doing these things. Okay? So if you go and start putting plants in the middle of urban environments, the benefits are, in fact, in New York, they finally started thinking that perhaps they should start planting trees again. Okay, so energy capture, you can do it via leaves, whether you use it directly or store it, that's another matter. Okay, you can use the things along walls to provide thermal insulation, and some work going on in this area. There is an enormous effect in evaporative cooling, in moderating local climate by this transpiration phenomenon. And people have done measurements in parts of the world where you can see, if you look at the thermal images of cities, where you've got the park area, like London, in the middle of the summer, not last summer, a good summer, where you've got the park area, and then you've got the 100% concrete kind of environment, the temperature difference is huge. Okay? So the moderating effect of plants is enormous. As well as, therefore, capturing energy, they will save you a lot of energy indirectly. You need less air conditioning system. Fewer kilowatts will be spent in ventilation. They have an important function for soil stabilization as well. And then they've got, as I said, this important buffering function, because they can trap so much water inside the cells and release as evaporative, not as liquid, but as vapor. Okay, they can contribute very significantly to moderate the effect of flooding and all these things. So to finish off, okay, some sort of reminders. Okay, if you want to involve themselves in these things, we need to accept the fact that you need to find inspiration, not just copy blindly. You need to think about very highly integrated design. You can see that all things happen within the same thing: the sensing, the actuation, the chemical response, the food storage. Everything is happening in the same object. We don't have different boxes with different functions. Simple materials, there's nothing special about the materials used in biology, but they are very complex structures, architecturally, geometrically, because that's the way you can manipulate the fibers to get to the functionality. You've got a relatively simple physical principles at the base of that. And one of the fascinating things about biology is how it can extract maximum benefit from very, very simple physical concepts. As I said, lotus effect, simply surface tension, sharp skin effect, it's purely the shape. You know, very, very simple things. But you need to get them right, and you need to get them right at the right level. And then perhaps as a new step is this higher level of synergy between biology itself and technology. In other words, yes, we can understand and do a lot of things from biological systems, but of course we can also improve our use of these biological systems for our own benefits. So you can see that these things can adapt themselves. This route knows very well that the water is along these channels. In other words, in the gaps between the bricks. It's not going to bother to create a route. So, you know, this is the manifestation of all the things that I've said. So, apologies if I overrun my time, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, George. I think the lecture was really nice in defining the term biomimetics for us that we've been using in the first term. Somehow, in these first three sessions, we had three sessions that tried to describe terminology that we use in design, but maybe sometimes we are not so much aware of what they mean. Like, for example, last week we tried to define term morphogenesis with Sarah Francescelli. Today, biomimetics with Giorgio. The next one will be Marco Dorigo, and we will discuss with him the term swarm intelligence and robotics. So you'll be reading also, I asked them to read the article from PhD. So if you have some question about them, please. If there's no question, there is one.
Hello, my name is Ian James. I'm a PhD researcher in ecological design and human geography at Royal Holloway. And I'm actually doing my PhD on what's missing in biomimetics and what's missing in biomimicry. And I found it very interesting towards the end of your presentation that you spoke about the synergy and the interactions. And I believe that that's one of the missing components in the advancing field of biomimicry, is the fact that it is driven by a language of inspiration. It uses metaphors to describe what's happening in natural processes, but when it's actually translated, it doesn't amount to the actual interactions, the actual interconnectivities within the grander system that is the Earth's organism. Do you believe that this is something that happens because of the language, the worldview of many, the practitioners coming from the fields of engineering and architecture? Or do you just think that it's one of those things where, people that are ecologists may not necessarily be as open and aware to the design language that's out in the field? I just kind of wanted to see what you thought about that.
I mean, it's a good question, and I think it's a bit of both. I think there's also this element of arrogance of the technology.
Yes.
Okay, the sky's the limit, we can do everything we want. There is a bit of that, and the problem of that is not so much the fact that it will or will not deliver. The problem of that is it hides away the fact that there is an awful lot of information in the biological world. We are really just scratching the surface. And as you said, the synergy aspects are really the most interesting one, the most difficult ones to appreciate. But I'll give you one example. Okay, years ago there was, still is actually, a company was making detectors. Well, I mean, their function was to make detectors for chemical detectors in air, whatever not. And the idea behind was, what you find at every airport, explosives, drugs, whatever. And then they produced this box, and I remember the talk that they gave because it took everybody by surprise. They had this little box, okay, with a kind of thing, and then they said, "What do you think is inside the box?" Electronic circuitry, whatever. No, there are 3 bees. 3 bees inside, sitting in wells. The bees have got a sensitivity of detection of 1 part in a trillion, okay, and nothing beats that. So what they decided, and forget about the biomimicry, if we can use these animals, because they have the functions that they have, then if we can organize ourselves to do that, then there's a lot to be gained. And I'm glad you're working on that topic, because it really is really the next step. And there is a second feedback loop on the thing. And that is that the more we understand about the synergy and the capacity and the sort of potential of the synergy, the more we are going to also provide convincing arguments for biodiversity. You know, when you lose 100 square miles of forest, it's like burning a library. This is exactly what it's like. You just say, well, all that can go up in smoke. There is so much information in that square 100 kilometers that we haven't got the faintest idea of what it can do. That is really crazy to throw away all that capital, intellectual capital, if you like, without even trying to understand how it works. So yes, these synergies are really a big thing. Yeah, I think that's very good. Excellent.
I've got a question actually.
Yeah.
I must say I find your work very inspiring and I resonate a lot with me. So, but I kind of think when you think about a forest, you know, you can look at it two ways. You can also think you burn it, it's a new beginning, because some bio or systems work, they need fire.
No, yeah, no,
So,
I mean, sure.
so you can look at it at both sides, but the question is, how do you now, you look at quite detailed, clever mechanisms, doesn't matter if it's like I'm looking at a fungus garden, how you can use that, how incredibly clever it is. But how would you now translate that into creating a new way of how you design your cities? You know, how would you go about using all your great ideas with your forests as well?
Well,
how do you, because you're actually really only touching on very minute areas, you're not actually looking at the whole
you're
picture.
absolutely right. And this is what I said at the beginning.
Yeah.
It is a big challenge to because on the small scale, relatively speaking, we've got already a number of technical solutions. They work, they are successful, whatever else. How do we move up in scale?
Yeah.
But the problem is that even going from the device to the building, we already got a big challenge, okay? Because, you know, we still design the buildings as static things, okay? We are just beginning to introduce some sort of dynamic response, but we do it at such a high cost because the technology we are using is very often the wrong one. So there is one step already underway. Now, how you go from the building to the urban scale is a big challenge, as I said, because it is not only a technical problem. There is a kind of social overlay on the thing. Now, one thing that biology, you can do a lot, you can learn an awful lot of biology. You're not going to learn about social sciences. You're not going to learn about ethics. You're not going to learn about morals. And you are not going to learn about making decisions for the future. Biology cannot do that. It simply say, look, this is the best answer for now. Don't ask me what is going to happen in 20 years now, because I don't know. No, this is the problem we have. The problem we have is that we need to extrapolate, if you like, beyond our lifetime. And that is something that biology will not be able to say. All we can do is say, look, there are a number of solutions, okay, technical or otherwise, that we can start implementing, okay, as I said, more of the symbiotic type as opposed to the mimetic type, perhaps. But I think it's a question of small increments, okay? Because as I said, it's going to be very, very difficult to look at, you know, if you take the equivalent of cities, which are termite nests, or, you know, there are not very many of those, first of all. I mean, unless you start thinking about the forest as your city. And there you're going to find a different kind of interaction between these things. You can find a lot higher level of biodiversity. Remember, termites are very programmed animals, okay, or bees or whatever. No, I mean, they have amazing capacities from a physical, sensorial point of view, but they're not particularly smart, okay? And it will function with this kind of level. But if you go one level beyond, it's not going to work. Not in the same way. So, as I said, if you look at the forest, you can find an enormous amount. I mean, there are probably more insects, okay, in tropical forest in Brazil. In terms of individual insects, we're talking about hundreds of billions. Yeah. Plus all the other animals. Everything is there interacting. So synergies are really the key. Synergies between different species and synergies with the plants, which, if you like, represent the city of the system. So it's a big challenge, I agree with you. And I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm a student in RC16. I'm very quite interested in biological system. But in fact, when we look at different cities or different systems, as we can see, every city was influenced by different feedback or different elements. For example, social, economic level, history, cultural, whatever. So my question is, when we design a project in the urban scale, how can we keep balance between different feedback from other systems?
Well, to me, again, the only way to, if you like, strip off these various layers, cultural, traditional, historical, okay, you really need to go down and look at the needs. And I would say the best strategy is to say, measure everything in terms of energy requirements. At the end of the day, this is the only currency which makes sense. Because no matter how evolved your city is, if you take away the energy input, you've got nothing. Nothing different from a turbine has for energy. So I think one way to have a strategy is really to rethink about what is the real essence, okay, of a city. And the real essence at the end of the day is energy flow and information flow. Nothing more, nothing less. And this, you can then sort of add different layers. But if you look at every city, whatever the culture may or may not be, these two things remain. Okay, information flow, energy flow.
I guess I just wanted to kind of add on to what you were saying. There are cultural aspects, there are economic aspects, but in my dissertation, I pretty much just grouped them into three different categories. You have the philosophy, which there is a philosophical aspect of what the city is, that he's talking about with energy flow, bringing it back down to its basic philosophical principles. You have the processes, which this is what biomimicry is trying to grapple with, is how do you take something from its philosophical aspects into applications other than what it's typically used for. And then the last part, I call it the presencing or the practice, where this actually gets to be put into some type of category of interaction of how it's actually used. And when you look at a design process, a design philosophy and design practice within these types of categories, you begin to understand that maybe it's not the city that needs to be created. Maybe it's something beyond the city. Maybe it's something beyond the house. Maybe it's something beyond the building. And that allows for you to begin to design not only quite differently within what you're creating with materials and within how it looks physiologically, but then how it relates and interconnects to the other species within that the ecological system. So I definitely agree. There's so many different areas, but the way that you have to approach it, that philosophical component is definitely going to dictate it, because architects, in a lot of ways, when they're using biology, I'm also, I guess, guilty of it as well. I didn't consider the philosophical aspect. What is this morals and ethics? Those things belong in philosophy, but you also have to have a genuine knowledge of what that is as well.
When you talk about energy, maybe it's interesting to clarify. Do you mean, because if you look at the city in terms of energy, you could do a kind of quantity of the overall city, but maybe it's more interesting to think about the flow of energy between single entities.
I mean, this is exactly the problem.
Because maybe you can talk a little bit more about it, because if not, the student maybe think about energy and maybe overall overarching calculation.
No. This is not so much energy, but if you like, it's energy management, energy flow.
Yeah,
And this
it's
is
more between the single entity of the single unit and now the energy can flow from one. It's almost as a training.
London, which, it's a vibrant city with 8 million people, lots of things happening and whatever. No, okay? 99% of the energy flowing into London is coming from power stations, which are 150 miles away. It's crazy. It's crazy because, I mean, historically it's understandable, but the question is that we've never revisited the historical context of what has led to the current situation. We simply added more and more. But I mean, you know, it's exactly what Claudia said. If you look at the buildings or the schematic of the city that we had before, this one here, okay? I mean, at the moment, everything of these things that we call the building is a separate entity. It's not interacting with the neighbors, it's not interfacing with the neighbors, it's completely in isolation, and it's entirely dependent on energy flow from something which comes from the outside. Okay? You cut that off, that's it, finished. Which is a very vulnerable position to be in, actually, incidentally. The moment you start thinking about the city as a sort of biological analog, if you like, I mean, instead of thinking of buildings, if you start thinking of buildings as individual cells, and then the aggregation is a tissue, okay, in which you have in clouds or anything, there is a lot of information, as well as a lot of energy flow going between these things. So, and everything is, on top of that, is actually captured in situ anyway, it's not shifted from 500 miles away. So the more we are revisiting and operating on a kind of local level, okay, the more we are going to get to the kind of synergies that he was talking about, because that is an obvious consequence of operating.
Somehow it's not about the overall quantity of energy, it's something that we are investigating as well with the idea of this resource Liverpool town and etc. It's not the overall quantity of energy that is interesting, but it's more the trading that can happen between different units, and now different units can integrate multiple qualities rather than just a tectonic one, but also quality of production of information or energy that can be traded between one unit and the other, and therefore create a different kind of system. Okay? This is really pertinent also to the master, because we are investigating the question of energy. Somehow we are proposing to create urbanization in the location where the energy gets produced.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, this is exactly, I mean, at that scale, this is the best way to say, look, I can get some ideas from biology, because this is exactly what it will not work otherwise. It's just simple as that. It will just not exist. So the fact that we exist in a different model is simply due to the fact that we are so geared to vast amounts of energy, which were cheap, available whenever not, until such time as you don't have any limit. Sure, it works. Okay, the moment it starts being a problem, then everything needs to be reassessed, because now things are not going to be the same, basically. And the different type of models got to be, and apart from anything else, given the fact also that we've got a continuous shift of population into urban environments.
It's more of a sort of biomimetic mode for the city of using energy, you know?
I think so. I think this is the way to do it at the energy level. I mean, the technical solution, individual ones are contributing bits and pieces here, there, and everywhere.
But the natural model of using energy is like decentralized in a way.
Absolutely.
But isn't that really going to be too slow? Would you say slow step by step? Aren't we going to, we've got this incredible pressure on these new urban centres, and even though it's a really amazing idea, but isn't it not going to give us a problem? It's not going to deliver when we actually need it the most.
Good question. And there is a danger. There is, without any question, a danger, because the pace at which we can adapt and remodel is not going to be necessarily in phase with the physical, brutal pace, rate of change of what is happening. So it is. I think it's a big issue as well. We can try to catch up, but the question is, do we have enough speed to keep up with what is going on? And I sometimes doubt, because because you can see that. I mean, come on, look at what happens to the eastern states and the United States. So, you know, -20, -30 for weeks on end. Think of the amount of energy that change has produced, the amount of consumption, energy, additional consumption of energy.
That is not a biomimetic problem, comes also a political problem, because the fact
Sure,
that there
at
is
some
not a
point,
change.
at some point you have that, but this is the problem. The more you are along the model that you said, the kind of integrated, diffuse type of thing, and the less vulnerable you are to these big changes, because you are not dependent on the fact that your supply is going to sort of disappear from one day to the next, or that one big accident will stop you having your whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good, at least for me, an interesting model to sort of assimilate to dealing with like a local economy is microfinancing, which as a social model proves that it actually works in a really interesting way. And that's purely a social model built on social relationships. So the question of the social actually comes back for me then, because you view it as being an economic system. And if you look into microfinancing, it's all about dealing with localized exchange. It's going back to really understanding society in a much more.
Well, it is, but again, I think a lot of the negatives of society as we see it now are really the result of this overabundance of cheap energy.
Yeah.
This is really put a twist on the thing, which we find it very difficult to disconnect from. Interestingly enough, I was many, many years ago talking to a colleague, one of the biggest food manufacturing companies. And he says, you know, we're going crazy. I said, it's mad. What we're doing is completely daft. Okay, because instead of having food production organized on the local level, okay, we need to have this food production 500 kilometers away, 1,000 kilometers away. Come on, we're putting food on airplanes and transporting food on airplanes. It's just the law. I mean, in pound notes, it is justifiable. In kilojoules, no. This is the problem. That at the moment, for a long time, the connection between these two was much tighter. And the connection on the local level is much tighter. The moment you go into the modern financial world, there is a complete disconnect between the pound and the kilo.
There was this amazing op-ed in the New York Times last week about why there isn't any GMO wheat in the U.S. And the person that was writing this was saying, well, there should be GMO wheat in the U.S. because then it would catch on to the soy and corn production in the U.S., which has actually ruined the local agricultural communities of the entire country. And it's a really interesting problem. Well, maybe wheat suppliers are holding on to GMO wheat because they can establish an economy that functions. So there's all these models, there's these models that you guys can use as examples for sort of giving an argument to the way that you utilize biological models as well.
Yeah, the question is, I understand all the problematics, but how do you solve it? I mean, would you
Scale,
intervene?
Gina, scale. You
Yeah.
think about, you
Yeah,
be on a
but-
specific scale.
I think that's right. And you need the point is that in order to create something big, you can look at it from a big picture altogether, say, how am I going to deal with that? Or you can start thinking about those local level. And local level, a lot of the problems are not as complicated. Then you go to hope that you get a kind of cooperative effect. And the thing is going to start connecting in a kind of thing. Because if you try to solve the problem on a global scale, we're not going to win, that's for sure.
But I think it's important for you guys to recognize that when we mean local, we don't necessarily mean micro.
No.
Yeah, like that's something that I'm seeing at least come out in essay book.
No, local is
That there's a confusion
relative.
between these.
Depends on the environment, depends where you are, the culture, whatever. No, what is local here is not local there. I agree with that. It's a question of defining, well, rationalizing what local means.
Exactly.
But this, I think, is interesting also in relationship to the kind of simulations, like digital simulations we were doing in our class in the first term, but I think it applies to other classes as well. it's quite interesting in your presentation. You began to include these digital models as biomimetic or bio-inspired, because obviously it is not just about material, but it's about also communication logics and how they become mechanisms of problem solving or collective intelligence, as we will discuss next week as well with Marco Dorigo. But I think that is also a way of defining local, no? What does it mean? Because obviously most of these models are based on the idea of local interactions and local rules, and then of course emergent patterns, emergent behaviors, and the definition of the local in that sense, it's perhaps the most interesting, one of the most interesting design elements, if you want, because obviously you have a simulation that has a certain level of abstraction, because we went through this process of abstraction you were talking about, and then the moment it needs to be kind of a re-engineered back, it's about designing these are kind of local interaction or the kind of materiality or perhaps energetic and informational exchange that happens at this local level of interaction, which then can be maybe through simulation we can speculate what would emerge at a larger scale.
The one problem that one has with the digital models, as well as the reality of what we see, whether it is biological or all is the same, is the fact that our knowledge of the environment and our knowledge of the dynamics of the environment is virtually non-existent. In other words, if we knew exactly, what the temperature, humidity, the temperature gradient, whatever, then we could design the obvious answer to this problem.
It's kind of changing rapidly, though.
It changes, that's the problem. And so we are trying to put static structures in what is a dynamic environment, which is not going to work. It's pretty obvious. So biology is simply saying, look, I'm not going to try to optimize anything, because if I optimize, I'm dead. Basically, I'm backing off on the optimization. It's perfectly possible. We've got examples where the things are pushed to the limit for one reason or another. But you're backing off to give yourself the possibility of adapting, so that if the change occurs, you are not so vulnerable, then everything is going opposite direction to the one you expected. So the fact that you don't have the complete knowledge of your environment really should produce a different strategy, whereas a lot of what we do at the moment is based, predicated on the fact that we know exactly what's going to happen. Come on, we are fooling ourselves, we're keeping ourselves. We don't. I mean, I'm not recording it when he works on urban climate. He said, urban climate is maddening. I mean, you think a global climate is complicated. He says, look at the urban climate. It's even more complicated, because the multitude of things which can happen, the multitude of events, the multitude of changes are so dynamic that, not surprising, what they say is that up to now, their models, the big computer models, are working on a scale of 1 square kilometer. He says, inside 1 square kilometer, we don't know. Basically.
And optimization is an equilibrium. They're not the same thing. I think going back to the question that you were asking is how do we solve it? I went and I lived out in Nicaragua with a group of the indigenous of Naua on the island of Ometepe. And I was communicating and just talking with a couple of different shamans in the area. And they have a different concept of energy. Energy isn't something that you're going to own or produce. It's there. It just already exists. It's figuring out the ways to harness it. And I just observed different types of non-human primates and the non-human human primate relationship within the forest. And for around 400 years, the people have actually been using the horticulture technique of grafting to create what you would consider wildlife corridors or like living fences here in the UK. And they've been integrating those for their building frames. So their building frames are actually connected to the natural system, and they learned it from the cultural mythology on the howler monkeys, which they call the architects of the forest, actually bending and breaking the branches over time to create these massive systems that they're able to get around the forest through, because they have a different type of dependency on it. And that energy was the synergy. It was an interconnection, an interrelationship between one organism and the next. And I believe that that's the vital philosophy that needs to be solved. It doesn't matter what energy source we go to. It doesn't matter if we look at the local or the global scale. If that definition is not redefined, if it's not reapplied within how we create the city as an organism, we're only going to continue to become the architects of our own demise. You know, we're going to constantly be looking at optimization. How much can we produce? How much can we take? How much can we consume? What is, I mean, the irony is sustainable consumerism, you know? You know, it's very, you know, we're using these, you know, very juxtapositions and different ways of looking at what it is that we're doing and trying to justify it. But it has to be redefined. So that's the only way that it's going to solve, is when, you know, the human consciousness begins to, I guess, imagine themselves as an organism within that environment, noticing that the energy is a relationship between that one organism, which, you know, which is the human, and how they interrelate to the other organisms within that environment and those ecological forces. So I would say that, you know, if you're looking at something, when it comes down to, you know, is it a local or a global scale, it's a global scale. And within that global scale, it has to be redefined by the terminology that you're using, because that global scale will use different locals. I mean, everyone's going to have a different way of applying it. But if, you know, those terms are not shared, are not applied across the board, you're only going to continue back at square one where you already existed.
I agree. It's all about education. And so we're talking about, we've got how many billion people, and how are we ever going to achieve that? You know, you have to have some parameters then, and who defines them? You know, you in that catch-22. You know, it's this continuous loop of, is it you setting the parameters, or is it the community or the collective consciousness which decides that? And that is probably the eternal question. I don't know. Is that the question?
That is true, but again, what was said before, I think is valid in the sense, again, maybe the strategy is indeed to redefine these things on a more local level, and let these local levels, because they are more dynamic and more responsive. It's a bit like, you know, dealing with industries. You can deal with the big ones, and you can deal with the small ones. And generally speaking, the more creative and the more adaptive ones are the small ones. The big ones, you've got to be. So we need to shift the decision-making process, if you like, to some extent, to a much more local level. Because that is going to respond more effectively, at least in its own dimension. Okay, then you start aggregating things like that, but trying to do it from the top down is almost impossible. It's gone too far already. I mean, you know, we are so dependent on so many superficial things. I mean, I remember getting stuck in Vienna for 4 days because the volcano erupted in Iceland, and suddenly, you know, the whole of Europe didn't exist anymore. Come on, this is the 21st century. Our technology, you know, this is what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that we underestimate, again, because we're technically arrogant to a large extent, we underestimate the enormous effect, because our systems are still relatively primitive, okay, we underestimate the effect of some of these big global events, if you like, natural ones. Flooding, same thing. Earthquakes, same thing. And on. You know, it is something that, with the best will in the world, I think we have to be a little bit more humble and say, look, we really do not know how to deal with this problem. Not that it means we cannot try to address it, but I think it's better than try to address it in the wrong way, which is very often what we're doing.
Thanks. Okay.